mentor to me, to many of our staff, and someone I really consider to be a dear friend. Bryant, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I have invited Bryant here today to talk with me about a few things. For a little bit of background, after the public and very brutal killing of George Floyd, Bryant requested that as a leadership team at Interfaith Works Homeless Services that we start to hold space each month to talk about hard stuff, about race, politics, deep feelings, vulnerability, things that were coming up for each of us, and to really make an intentional, carved out time to connect in that way, which is something that we had done here and there, but never in like a more formal, intentional way. So he named this our courageous conversation. And it wasn't, like I said, the first time we'd ever done it, but the first time we made it a standing meeting. So these talks and many that I've had with Bryant over the years, been lucky enough to have taught me so much, really deepened my resolve for justice and for better understanding, and just kind of made me better person in general. I don't really know how else to say it. It's like you've just opened my eyes to things in new and different ways that I've never been able to get to before or something. And I think it's because just we have a really trusted relationship. And part of that is that I also want to kind of call myself out and recognize that I asked Bryant to do this really last minute. I'll be honest about that. And, like asking this of you at this time, it's just like, I want to just recognize that and thank you so much for doing it, for rearranging your day and providing your time and energy for our community. So thank you.
Anytime. You're welcome anytime. I rock with you anytime.
So my hope is to just be able to give our community a little bit of insight into you, who you are, what you do, and to just shine a little bit of light about you as a dedicated leader in our community who often goes unrecognized, and you just show up over and over, and you have for years. So I want to start by checking in. Right before we went live, Bryant was like, feet on the floor, 10 toes planted, and I know that I needed that before we jumped in. But if you could sum up in a few words or sentences how you're doing, feeling, showing up today, what would that be?
From a place of being very vulnerable, some private conversation that I'm having, I'm okay, but I'm not always all right. But I'm okay. I think that would be the summary of it.
Yeah, like you're maintaining, but that doesn't mean that everything's good.
Oh, most definitely, most definitely, most definitely. And there's a lot of context behind that. Um, we, some of us are in the shallow end of the pool, some of us are in the deep end of the pool, but we're all okay. But are we all right? That's a whole nother conversation that gives more context. It requires a little bit more vulnerability, being a little bit more vulnerable and trusting in some places and spaces to have those conversations. But overall, no, I'm ready. I'm good. I'm good to go.
You move through a lot of different places in life and like different institutions and things like that. And you've taught me a lot about leaning in, which is part of the inspiration for this show, by the way, was through our courageous conversations together. So why does it feel important to you to have courageous conversations in your life and all of the different places and spaces that you move within, even if it's uncomfortable or scary to do it?
There are a couple of things to that. One of the things is for context. So I like harp and preach all the time about content versus context. So like, for example, I'm okay, but I'm not all right. And so what that looks like is this idea of like, if we're in these spaces and places and we're trying to do these things together, it is really and truly important for us to understand the context in which we see these things. And so through the lens of courageous conversation, we can actually come to a place where we can talk about, like, for example, my historical understanding of my existence in the country, right? Like the reality of 100 years ago, we would not be able to do this. And not because of social media, but because policies and practices that are in place would not allow us to have these types of conversations. I can understand that. I think equality is a real thing, but I don't always believe in equality. And what that context looks like is that we are not all, like I say all the time, I wasn't born 6'2", 220 with a 48-inch vertical, and nobody offered me a contract. So, right. So there's this idea that we have these very generalized understandings of things without recognizing openly and honestly and always the nuances that make these things different. Right. So we can't always be equal, but we can be fair. I recognize that that's a very controversial statement, but it doesn't negate what it is and what it means. So through these conversations, we can have these more contextual and reality-based understandings of where we are. And then we can also recognize our shortcomings, some of the gaps and some of the things that we have. And we can then come together to help support each other in those spaces and places.
I think that lesson of, like, yeah, like leaning into, at the risk of sounding corny, like leaning into the shortcomings and being able to recognize them and name them, and then still somehow feel supported by whoever you're sharing that space with. I just feel like that's something that is such an undervalued thing in our society. And so then it creates, whether it's through conversations like this or whether it's through, grappling with addiction or some kind of like recovery from whatever, lately I've been hearing a lot of comparisons of racism and the unlearning of racism as to addiction and addiction recovery. And like, I think that has just been one of the major lessons for me, is to be able to be in a place with you, admit my shortcomings, be able to tell you when you say something that maybe doesn't sit right with me or I don't understand, and learn more about it. And that's been really transformative.
Mm-hmm. I think that it goes both ways. Like the George Floyd incident, the murder of George Floyd, it moved me in ways that other things have not. And I would not be being 100% honest if I didn't say that there were some moments, some very intense moments in my world, my individual world. And then the idea that there are people who I interact with who would really and truly understand what that meant to me and what that felt like to me. And the idea that it did not impact people differently. Well, we know that because there are a lot of different narratives and a lot of different information, a lot of different opinions that are moving around about that. And then again, through the lens of the conversations that we have, if there is this idea of trust, that we can say, hey, look, right now I'm kind of bothered about this thing, or I don't understand this thing, or what if, or what about, and then how these things greatly shape like how we move through our spaces, our cognition, our understanding, our beliefs, our understandings. I'm repeating myself there, but those are real things, and we're real people, right? We're real people with real feelings and real emotions, and if we're going to tackle these things, we have to give ourselves the ability to be human. And it's important that we create safe spaces and places for us to be able to do it.
And I think what's really struck me about this last year too is just like the work that we do is already so nuanced and so raw at the shelter, and that this has been an opportunity to like go even deeper into that and find those same sort of connections and realness and vulnerability with our shelter guests, with our staff. And some of our more stressful times during this year have been that our shelter is right in the middle of where many of the protests and the counter protests come together. And that's been hard and scary.
Mhm.
And managing all of those feelings on top of your own personal feelings that are coming up, like, I don't know, it's just been a lot. Do you have anything you want to say about that?
It's been a lot. I don't know. Is it a lot? Echoing your statement. Yes, there are a lot of things. And out of sight, out of mind is the thing that comes to mind. There are these things that like people aren't directly experiencing, and then even then, our experiences is our current position is how we experience it is shaped by our previous experiences. Right? So there's this like rolling idea of experiences, past, present, and future, and how that is shaped. And it is difficult. It's coupled with a lot of other things that are currently happening. There are these things that are happening right before our eyes that we're not very consciously aware of. And there's a huge generational shift of, for lack of better choice of words, command, control, and power, right? Which is realigning a lot of the cultural values and beliefs that we have in the country. And then that most definitely plays on how we see policy, economics, finance, all these other things that are coming into play. So you couple that with, you pair that with, and then you join that with, you know, what it looks like these things that we're seeing physically, like we're physically seeing these changes happen at what seems to be a very alarming rate, which really is not that fast, but it's that fast. And then you couple that with what I'm already going through and what you're going through. And then you throw a little pandemic, sprinkle a little pandemic, a little COVID-19
Oh yeah, that.
in, right? Right. And then depending upon where you are, you throw a little weather in it, a little immigration issue in it, a little homeless issue in it, depending upon where you are, a little couple of these and a little bit of that. And it can make for a very, very complicated, convoluted, conflated, confusing, angry situations for people to have to deal with. And so, yeah, it's a lot. I think a lot might be an understatement. If we have the ability to really look at it through the lens of like what we're able to facilitate and what we can hold space for, and the things, and those are just the things that we know about. We're not talking about the deep rooted things and how those affect how we see and move through different spaces.
Yeah, it's really been a lot. I feel like when the code blue happened, so last weekend, we usually about once a year, we have the county contract to respond to inclement weather events, hazardous weather events. And so the snow last weekend meant that we stood up some extra shelter. Bryant had to pull an overnight, which always means that we're short staffed, and it really did feel like on top of everything there's like an apocalyptic snowstorm. Okay. I guess that's what
Right,
we're dealing with. Yeah.
right.
So something you often talk about is how, and you kind of, I think, started to bring this up a little bit, but you talk about how equity and diversity do not equal inclusion.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about that, like how you see that playing out in different spaces?
There are a lot of contextual examples. One of the examples that I like to use is being invited to a party
Mm-hmm.
and then playing the music that I like, and then the music that I like everyone dances to, and then allowing me to DJ, and then people dance to the music. And so, there's this idea that through the lens of like, if I'm going to give you these, like asking me to come in and take my opinion, like that's great. But then if there's not going to be the idea that my opinion is going to be implemented into the larger processes to contribute to the larger system, then that's not necessarily being included. Like hearing my voice, yes, but then if what I'm saying is going to be not only we're taking into consideration, but then actually there's going to be some actual tangible physical implementation of what I'm saying into this idea, this policy, this whatever the thing may or may not be, that's not being very inclusive. And so there is this thing that we see happen a lot, where it almost kind of sort of falls along the lines of like separate but equal, right? Right. So there's this idea that we're going to give these things that you're asking for in these ways that are not contextually relevant to what is needed. But then I get to pat myself on the back and say, well, we did hear you. We gave you this thing, right? But then if it's not garnering the same results, it's not very inclusive. And so there again is another huge gap in all the areas and spaces where we find, that these things are happening. What I don't have is the solution, but I do know that it is a huge issue that we have society-wise. And there's some ideas about going about how to fix it, but then that's another conversation for another time.
Well, I think that, when we were talking ahead of time for this meeting, the idea of Black History Month, and that we're nearing the end of that. And I think some of what you're talking about is, because elements of what you're talking about are, involve this tokenization, or even utilizing input of Black and Indigenous people of color to create monetary gains for other things, or whatever, like this sort of tokenization. Like, I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit about Black History Month and what it means to you, or what it represents to you, sort of within the context of this idea that equity and diversity don't necessarily equal inclusion. Does that make sense?
It does. So when so I love Black History Month. Like, I love it. And I think it is much needed, because there's not a lot of inclusion, right? Yeah. So when we think of Black History Month, there are these ideas behind it. And there's some very notable people that we talk about quite often in Black History Month, and they're great, wonderful, like the icons of the movement. But there's this idea that, like, what we don't think about, like, we think about Frederick Douglass, and then we kind of sort of skip Booker T. Washington, and then we know who is a prominent educator in the movement for equity and diversity and inclusion through technical aspects of education for Black people. And then we kind of sort of skip over Ida B. Wells. Like, there are these people who get these really nice honorable mentions that are not always, at least in the world that I operate in. I'm not saying that they do not get large, a lot of light on their contributions, but in the worlds that I operate in, they're not always celebrated. And so then there's this idea that, like, we forget about Ida B. Wells, who was monumental in the suffrage movement and anti-lynching. And we're talking about the late 1800s, early 1800s, Frederick Douglass into the late 1800s. That's like 100 years of civil rights movement that civil rights activism that we talk about, like, through this very one-dimensional lens, for lack of a better choice of words. It's like we talk about people, but we don't talk about the things that happen and how they happen in the context in which they lifted and shifted the culture into moving towards being more inclusive, right? And then we get into Charles Houston, and we start talking about things like Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, and how these things into the early 1900s lifted and shifted the culture even more towards these ideas of diversity and inclusion. And so there are these ideas, like these really big, broad shoulders that fill a lot of these gaps. I think about one of the things that makes me think about in like this correlation between, like, the argument behind the Confederate flag, and then there's this idea that, like, it's this thing that just happened, and, like, people are unaware that, like, in the 60s, South Carolina was having this huge thing about the Confederate flag that people are just so unaware of. Oh, this thing, it was just because, no, actually it's been you're talking about, like, 50 plus years now, there has been this conversation going on about it. And so then this idea, like, through what inclusion can look like on the adverse side, is that, like, it's a thing when I become aware of it. Like it hasn't been this ongoing thing that has been forever, ever, ever in the day, right? Like since the beginning. It's just like when I become aware of it, oh, now it's either this really great thing that we need to work on, or it's like, oh, are you just being kind of temperamental about it, or sensitive, or whatever the term analogy might be used. So through the lens of like inclusion, there's this idea that these things have always been inclusive, mutually inclusive, right? And so, but then there are these things that are like, for lack of better choice of words, like that pacify that. And so like through the lens like Black History Month, there's this idea that we can then highlight these things to show that like this has been an ongoing thing forever. Like it's not just something that just started when I turned on whatever my favorite news channel or news outlet is, and bam, it's right there in my face. I'm like, oh my goodness, what is this going on? No, it's mutually inclusive. It's been here like forever. It's just when a person becomes aware of it, how they then choose to deal with it. And if it's not in the idea of being in, like the term is inclusive, if it's not that, then equity and parity and all those things are great. But if they're not going to garner the results, then it's not being very inclusive. No.
Yeah. I think that, okay, so something that you said about the like equity, diversity, so like being invited to the party, playing the music at the party, and then you're DJing the party, like thinking about it in that sort of way of what each of those steps mean. And I've also heard it on another podcast that Cabin Light actually produces, also the Drop in Truth Zero Apologies Drop in Truth podcast. It was described in a similarly very like clear way of being invited to the party, being asked what game you want to play at the party, and then the idea of like centering, meaning like here you are as part of this thing, what would you like to see happen at this party, right? And then that's what we do. Then we do that thing that you want to see happen. I think that that's just so important for people to like get those, I don't know, just to like have those kind of conversations of like, this is what we're talking about, and this isn't some untouchable, the idea of inclusion is not some untouchable thing. I don't know.
It's not unrealistic. So there's some ideas about how these things will benefit us and not how these things will hurt or harm us. And so there's the idea like through like the some very basic ideas about how we move through the spaces, that everything that we do is in the form of advocacy. Like it doesn't matter what it is. Like, so if it doesn't necessarily, and the outcomes, not the impacts, the outcomes don't hinge on necessarily the motivations of the action, right? And so everything that everybody does is this form of advocacy. But then the question is how does this thing, inclusion, enhance my existence and my being and my understanding and my knowledge and my wisdom and my pocketbook, my wallet? And so there's this idea of how these things like subconsciously move and consciously move through people's areas of focus and spaces and places. And so if there's ever this idea that through the lens of inclusion, I'm going to be losing out, then we would have a courageous conversation about how do you think doing this thing is going to make you lose? Right? Yeah. And then there's this idea like through the lens of inclusion, like, well, or is it about the overall health and wealth and safety and welfare of the thing? Or is it about this individual overt, covert, conscious, unconscious choice or bias that a person has? Right? So like you invite me to the party. Why do you invite me to the party? Right. And then, right. So that's the first question, is like, and not from a pessimistic, a negative way. It's like, well, why are you inviting me to this party? Like, what's going on? What's
Where's
going on?
that coming from?
Right.
Where's that invitation coming from?
Right. And then if it's a genuine and authentic, which I don't have the monopoly on the definition and presentation of genuine and authentic, then it would be either you're coming here, I'm inviting you to the party so we can understand you, or we're inviting you to the party so you can understand me. Then we're talking about power differentials. But before I get real nitpicky into these processes, as I like to do so often.
And we love that you do.
Right. Just the idea of trying to expand the conversation through the lens of basically a mental process about how we can then do these things and understand what are the underlying motivations behind it. Right. And so there's this constant, this antecedent, this thing that America, right? And then there's this catalyst that happens, George Floyd. And then it reshapes the motivation. And then the motivation then drives the intent. And the intent is nothing more than a plan or an agenda. And then there's a decision-making process based on resourcing for the action. And then the action then has an outcome. And then the outcome then has an impact, right? So like, for example, and I'm using this as an example, like a DUI. A DUI is not an impact, it's an outcome, right? But it has a tendency to evolve and rotate throughout the process as it, like, for example, that the impact is going out and doing something and getting a DUI. But then as the process expands and evolves through what it does, we find that it then becomes an outcome because there's something that happens after that and something that happens after that. So through the lens of inclusion, when we're talking about people, how do they see that as this motivation, as this action, as this outcome, as this impact, or is it some other things that are happening in the process of people's minds, if that makes any kind of sense without getting too technical about it, right? What does inclusion mean and what does that look like? And how do we shift the conversation into being more positive? Like, if I come to your party, am I going to enhance the party? Am I going to like mess up the party, right? And so those are the types of conversations that we can have to get better understanding about where we are and what we're trying to do. Right? If that makes any kind of sense without me traveling too much.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to point out that Bryant always enhances the party because he is one of the best karaoke singers I have ever seen in my life. So if everybody is able and willing to come to our Up and Smoke barbecue this summer, if we're able to have it because of COVID, you can see Bryant just totally ripping Welcome to the Jungle, and it will blow your mind.
Okay.
So you always enhance the party, in my
opinion. Right. One of the things I think about is that this is a process, right? Everything is a process, and the idea is, especially like through the lens in which I work, is like trying to get people to expand on the process, right? So like, what are these things and what do they actually mean and how do they come together, so that they're just not these overgeneralized topics that we're having. Like, there's this EDI conversation that we're having. It's very generalized, right? When we get into what equity is, what diversity is, what inclusion is, like, and then how do the three of them come together, and then what is the larger thing that happens in the mind when we think about those things, and how that then lifts and shifts how we then engage those processes. Yeah.
I like thinking about that because, a lot of people are talking about how, or more kind of in the mainstream, I think, than I've seen it before, talking about how this work is like a continuous process. It's never done. Like, you're never going to be not racist anymore or something like that. Like, you're always, and I like thinking about what I just saw in my mind when you were saying that was like this idea of concentric circles. Like, you're always just like expanding it further and further. Because that feels, visualizing it that way feels really supportive and like a thing on my experiences is that it really lift and it really does like support
Mm-hmm.
and that I think really positive. I appreciate you saying the positive because that is so important is just to recognize that like it gives life
Mm-hmm.
to do this. It gives life to like continue down this road and
Mm-hmm.
it benefits everyone
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
truly.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. Yeah.
I was also have been looking into like the history of social work too, like just to go back to Black History Month for a little bit and
Mm-hmm.
to think about how the profession of social work was one of the earliest like integrated professions and um I just feel like it's so interesting that you've had your path from 21-year military veteran. How many tours did you serve
Um,
overseas?
oh, to include uh, five, 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 six,
And
six, six, five, five, six,
and
something like
then yeah, and then your path wound around to social worker and winding up at our shelter, you know? And
that.
I find that so I don't know, I just find it so interesting and is there anything that you have to like share about kind of that pathway and what sort of the profession of social work means to you?
I didn't want to be a social worker. It was not. Social work was not in my mindset. It was not a thing. That was not a. It just wasn't a thing. But a lot of life events happened, and things kind of move and lift and shift. And then I'm originally from Pensacola, Florida, and so I joined the Army when I was 17 years old, and I was a young, barrel-chested paratrooper freedom fighter with 82nd Airborne Division, and that shaped a lot of who and what I am. And I moved through a lot of different places, and a lot of things happened. Some good, some bad, and then things happened, and then I found myself here in Washington State, and I was retired. And at the advice of a friend, I went to school, and I was very fortunate to have had two assignments that were under the training sphere of the Army. And so I was able to learn some things. One of them being in Fort Knox, and then the other one was I was actually a cadre member at the University of California, Santa Barbara for about 4 years, which was a huge eye-opening experience for me. And then some of the things that I learned in that process was that we do a very good job of telling people what to do. We don't always do a good job of telling people how to do it. And so there's always this narrative to go to school, but but there was never this how. I remember when I was in Fort Bragg, and I remember somebody told me about the first time I ever heard of an education plan. And I was like, what's an education plan? And she was like, well, that's so you don't take a lot of unnecessary classes. And I'm like, they're unnecessary classes. And I'm like, I'm like 20 years old. Like, what is it? Like, how is it? Like, it's education. How could that be unnecessary? And then we had to go through this conversation of like, well, what degree completion looked like and all these other things, and being very specific about these things. And then getting out, I I rode around for a little while, and then on the advice of a friend, told me to become a counselor. And so I started out in a totally different area, specific wise, and then it turned into social work, and then it turned into being here at the shelter. And so, but that also tells me that 10 years ago, I had no idea. So to be teachable and remain open to the experience, because if we can do that and we show up, like, life will pull our strengths and tell us which way to go. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah.
Very.
No, totally. I appreciate it. And it's, I mean, and you are like a counselor to so many folks at the shelter, and you're extremely, to staff, to guests, to neighbors, you know, to everybody. Like it's just, you can, I mean, I think that that's true for my own journey through social work, is that there's this thing inside you that you just can't move away from.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you try to move away from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it's really amazing that we've been able to create this space where we can wind up, you know, and wind up together.
Right. Well, I remember seeing your TED talk. I remember that. And then I remember saying, I want to talk to this person. Because at that time I was in the space of trying to figure out which way to go. And, you know, I was moving through these things. And I went to the TED talk. I'm not trying to be funny. Like I didn't, like you were not the focus of the TED talk. You just happened to be there and you were talking, and we were down on Washington. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, let me, and then it ended up being that through UW, I was able to meet people and talk to people, and then it kind of came back around kind of full circle. And so, a lot of shared experiences and finding that path that was most suitable. And, you know, the MSW path just happened to be where my strengths lied. And so I was very happy about the decisions that I made.
Well, I always like talk about people, you know, you have to really be able to like get it. I don't know how else really to explain it about the shelter and the way that we do things and the approach that we have. It's like you either get it and you get hooked, or you don't get it and you bail pretty quick, right? And
right.
And so we always, Bryant and I always laugh about one time early on when you were doing your practicum. Somebody had some money that they wanted us to hold on to, and we didn't have any envelopes because we had no money to buy any kind of office supplies. And so I put her money in some like piece of paper and started stapling it to like make an envelope. And then what did I say? I was like, this is what an MSW buys you.
Right. Right.
But it's like, I mean, I feel like that's the reality of just like doing this kind of like hardcore justice work for so long, is like you step up and you do what you got to do.
Right. And then like 3 years later, I'm telling you, like, yeah, so this is what the MSW bought me. I'm making a litter box out of some trash bags and an old fruit box or something from like some donations from Costco. And I like stapled a little bag. And yeah, this is what the MSW got me. It's what we do. Right.
Yeah. It's just like showing up for people. You gotta just do it. And you gotta be real.
All right, it's gotta happen. We're gonna make this work one way or another.
Yeah. Well, Bryant, what are some of your, to end kind of on this idea of positivity and connection, what are some of your hopes for the coming year? They could be big, they could be small.
Yeah. I hope that it works. I hope that it works, right? And
like all this unearthing that's happening.
Everything.
Is that what you mean?
Yes, everything. Like I hope that works. I always want what people want. Like there's this thing where, you know, I want what's best for a person, but what I don't have the ability to do is determine for them what's best. Like they know what's best. So if that's what you want, like regardless of the outcome, regardless of the impact, that's what I want. And that sounds kind of, again, kind of contradicting on some levels. But if that's, you know, that's what I want. Like, that's what I hope that it works for people. That It works for them, and that they find that thing that they're looking for. And so outside of that, like, you know, everything else is very subjective based on my life. I want world peace. Like, you know, like I want to end hunger, world hunger, and you know, I want to end racism, right? My hopes are that it works, that whatever that thing is, for whatever that reason, that it works, and that it has a very healthy outcome for people, and that is subjective to their stance about where they are and where they see it, and then the rest will take care of itself. That's a very honest answer.
I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Bryant, is there anything else that you would like to add to let the community know, or, you know, burning desires before we sign off today?
No, it's a pleasure working at the shelter, and I have a blast, and I volunteered for it. So, you know, there isn't anything else much outside of that. And that I will say this: that if a person needs help, I hope that they have the courage to ask for it. Yeah, and that's what I hope for. Yeah.
I really hope for that too. And I think especially right now. So on one of our episodes earlier in the pandemic, we talked with a therapist and talked about the Department of Health put out this graph that was sort of like the trajectory of a natural disaster, and a pandemic could be considered a natural disaster, of course. And going into the 12th year, or the 12th month, the 1 year anniversary of a natural disaster is the time where mental health challenges are really at the height. And that's where we are right now. And so I just want to highlight, Bryant, again, what you just said, that I really hope that if people are struggling with loneliness, with addiction, with thoughts and feelings of not wanting to be alive, that we can reach out to people, we can find the people in our lives who make us laugh like you do for me, Bryant. And just those little moments of standing in the sun, doing whatever we need to do to like remember our humanity and remember that all of our humanity is connected. And it's so hard to remember that right now, especially. So
Yeah.
I just want to lift that up a little bit. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. We are more similar to one another than we are not alike. We're way more similar than different. Yes, we are. Everybody. Yeah, agree.
So I hope and plan that this is not the last that we hear from Bryant on Lean in Olympia. And thank you again for your time today. So check out our website, Facebook page, YouTube channel to stay connected. I also want to say that I mentioned the Zero Apologies Drop in Truce podcast. That's an amazing podcast that is hosted by Sarah Lloyd and Kyle Kronk. And I really recommend everybody to look that up and to listen to conversations that they are having around race and racism in our community locally. And that's all we got. And we will see everybody next time for Lean in Olympia. Take care, everyone.
Right. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Bryant.
Take care.
All right, we're off.
All right.
Thank you, Bryant. You
You're
rock.
welcome.